Welcome, welcome, and we'll start, of course, with our bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Thank you, Arlen. You should be able to see my screen right now. So we were talking about a situation where an Israelite had become very, very poor and essentially was at a point where they had to sell themselves into slavery, and that they were being sold to a person, a resident alien, someone who was living in the land of Israel, who was not of Israelite extraction, and had sold himself to them. And it was saying that their relatives should redeem them. And we're talking here about how that redemption is figured out. All right? So here we go. V'chishav im konehu, he should calculate with his purchaser, the person who purchased this Israelite, mishnat himachro lo, from the year when he was sold to him, ad shnat hayovel, up to the Jubilee year. V'haya kesef mimkaro, and the purchase price, the mispar shanim, should be calculated according to the number of years. In other words, so we'll give you an example in a moment. Kimei sachir, like the days of a hireling, yiyeh imo, he should be with him. So he's never an outright slave. Essentially, what we're saying then is that he is his labor is purchased for the years up until the Jubilee year. So here we go. Kimei sachir ye'emor, like the days of a hireling, he shall be with him. Cheshbon hamagia, in other words, the amount that is appropriate, l'chol shana v'shana yachshov. He shall calculate according to the amount that is appropriate for each year. Ki ilu niskar imo, as if he was hired by him, kol shana v'maneh, each year for a maneh. I think a maneh is 100 shekels. Vayinakelo, and he should reduce it by that. So let us say the example given, all right, is, let's say the person became a slave in the 30th year of the Jubilee, meaning that there's 20 years left, okay? So he has 20 years left until the Jubilee year, and he's worked for him for 5 years. He's worked for 5 years, and now there's 15 years left to the Jubilee year. So the way you calculate it is that if the original amount would have been 20 maneh, and since we're talking about a maneh per year, you reduce the amount of his redemption by 5 maneh, and so the person who's redeeming this person should pay the purchaser 15 maneh, and this individual can then go free. He's paid out his amount that he owes. That's essentially what this verse is telling us. And what the verse is also telling us is that we should, even though this person is not Jewish, we should be very careful about treating this person fairly and according to proper business etiquette. So, im od rabot b'shanim, if there are still many, many years to go before the Jubilee, in other words, lefihen yashiv gulato, according to that number of years, he should pay back his redemption price. Mikesef miknato, from the amount that he was originally purchased, from his purchase price. Let's take a look at Rashi on this. Im od rabot b'shanim ad hayovel. In other words, if there are still many years, Rashi puts in until the Jubilee year. Lefihen, according to them, hakol kamo shepirashti, it's exactly the way I've explained, is what Rashi just said. Let's see if there's anything else here. No Rashi on this particular page. Okay. Ve'im ma'at nish'ar b'shanim, if there are only a few left, in the years to go, Achnat Hayovel, until the Jubilee year, the Chishavlo again. He should calculate to the purchaser according to that amount. Kafi Shanav, according to his years, Yashiv et Gulato, he should return to the purchaser the amount for his redemption. Kischir shana b'shana, like an annual hireling, like someone who's hired by the year, imo, he should be with him, of course, being the purchaser, the ger who's purchased him. Lo yirdenu beferach le'enecha, he should not treat him with rigor before your eyes. In other words, you should make sure that the owner is not basically giving the crushing life to the servant or to this Israelite. Here we go. Lo yardena beparech le'enecha, beferech le'enecha. He should not rule over him with rigor before your eyes. Klomar, that is to say, v'ata ro'eh. In other words, if you see that he's doing that, you have to make sure he won't treat him that way. He cannot mistreat this individual. But should he not be redeemed in this particular manner, in the manner that we just mentioned, v'yatza b'shnat yovel, he should go out in the Jubilee year, hu uvanav imo, he and his children with him should be released in the Jubilee year. So what's the business of his children? You'll see. Ve'im lo yigal be'ele, and if he is not yigael, if he's not redeemed in one of these ways, be'ele hu nigal, in other words, these particular ways in which he is to be redeemed, ve'eno nigal b'sheish, and he is not redeemed in the 6th year, or at least he is. Remember, because we had talked about how the Israelite servant who's sold by the court is actually released after 6 years. In the 7th year he does. But this particular situation, he is only released in the Jubilee year. Because he's been paid, essentially, this person has got him out of debt by paying this amount of money, and so it's figured out according to the years. Hu uvanav imo, he and his sons with him. Hanochri, the non-Jew, chayav b'mezonot banav. He is obligated to make sure he covers the costs of feeding his children, feeding his sons. So going on here. Ki li v'nei Israel avadim. For the children of Israel are my slaves. They're my servants. Avadaihem, they are my servants, my slaves, asher hotzeti otam me'eretz Mitzrayim, in that I brought them out of the land of Egypt. Ani Hashem Elokechem, I the Lord am your God. Let's take a look at the Rashi on this. Kili v'nei Yisrael avadim. Shtari kodem. He says, my contract with them is an earlier contract. I have the original contract of sale of the Israelites to become my servants when I took them out of Egypt. And so in other words, they're already my servants, meaning that they cannot be slaves to anyone else. That's essentially what it's saying. They already are in the possession of God. And in some ways, of course, it is commenting in a metaphoric way about our relationship to God and the level of appreciation and obligation we have towards God, that we believe we are divinely obligated based on this. Ani Hashem Elokechem, I the Lord am your God. Kol hamish abdan milamata. So in other words, anyone who tries to subjugate them below, ki'ilu mishabdam milamala, it's as if they're subjugating them from above. Right? So in other words, what it's saying is that they don't, you can't say, oh well, they're slaves to a human being. That's separate from the fact that they're slaves to God, and it's the same thing. It happens to. This is the point I believe Rashi is making, is that there is Israelites cannot become slaves to anyone else. Our first obligation is to God. Lo ta'asu lachem elilim, you shall not make for yourselves gods, idols, ufesel, a statue, umatzeva, a sacred post, lo takimu lachem, you shall not erect for yourselves. For even maskit, and a maskit stone. Rashi explains it interestingly, and it seems to me as if the way Rashi's translating it is it sounds like a mosaic floor. And look at this, maskit and mosaic sound so similar. Lord titnu, you shall not place, ba'artzachem, you shall not place in your lands, the ishtachavot aleha, to prostrate yourself upon it. Ki ani Hashem Elokechem, for I, the Lord, am your God. So when it's saying, I am your Elohim, right? It's saying something very significant about our relationship to God. Lo tasuachem elilim. Do not make idols for yourselves. And this is from Torah Kohanim, from the Sifra on Leviticus. Keneged ze hanimka lenochri. This particular sentence is in reference to the person who has been sold to a non-Jew. Shelo yomar, that this Jew should not say, Ho'il v'rabi megale arayot, since my master is promiscuous. Af ani kemoto, I can behave in the same way. Ho'il v'rabi ovid avodat elilim, since my master worships idols. Af ani kemoto, I shall act like him, I shall imitate him. Ho'il v'rabi mechalel Shabbat, since my master desecrates the Shabbat. Af ani kemoto, I too can desecrate the Shabbat. L'chach ne'emru mikraot halalu. For this reason, these particular verses are stated here. For af ha-parshiot halalu, and not only that, but these particular sections, ne'amaru al haseder, they're actually said in a specific order, in an intentional order. But chila, to begin with, he's here al hashvi'it. We are warned about the working, or rather harvesting food for to take to market and to work the fields, plow the fields in the 7th year. V'im chamad mamon, but if he was too much in love with money, in other words, he was greedy, he didn't want to not plow and work his fields in the 7th year because he was worried he'd lose money like that, right? V'nechshad al hashvi'it, and is consequently under suspicion of having violated the 7th year. So for limkor mitaltalav, in the end he will have to sell his movable goods. Lachach, and for this reason, samach la v'chi timkuru memkar. That's why the next section deals with selling objects, selling items. Ma kativ be, what is written regarding this? O kano miyat, or is purchased from the hand of, in other words, from one person's property, etc. Davar hanikna miyad layad, the point is it's talking about something that is movable, something that can be acquired from one hand to another hand. Lo chazabo, if at this point he still hasn't learned his lesson, sof mocher achuzato, in the end he's going to have to sell his land holding, right, his patrimony. Lo chazabo, and if he still hasn't learned his lesson, sof mocher et peito, he is going to have to sell his household or his house, right? Lo chazabo, yeah, it talks about selling homes, I believe, right? Lo chazabo, and if he still hasn't learned his lesson, sof love beribit, he is going to borrow, having to pay interest. Kol elu ha'achronit, not every one of the later ones, kashot min harishonot. In other words, the second one is worse than the first, the third one is worse than the second, etc., having to do these things. Lo chazar bo, and if he still hasn't learned his lesson, sof mocher atatzmo, in the end he's going to have to sell himself. lo chazar bo, and if he still hasn't learned his lesson, lo dayo Israel, it's not sufficient that he had to sell himself into servitude to an Israelite, ela afilo lenochri, but all the more he is going to wind up selling himself to a non-Jew. For Evan Maskit, a figured stone, Rashi explains. Lashon kisui. So he says this word maskit has the connotation of covered. Kamo, and he says, like in the book of Exodus 33, Vesachoti kapai. I shall place my hand over you. I shall cover you with my hand. This is where God is telling Moses that he will reveal himself to Moses, but that he cannot see his face. He can only see the back, his back. Shemechasin hakarka, because in this case they cover the earth beritzpat avanim, with a floor of stones. So it reminds me, if you've ever been to that Beit Alpha synagogue and you see the mosaic floor that's there, this is what it sounds like. Lehishtachavot aleha, to prostrate yourself upon it. Afilu lashamayim, even if he is prostrating himself, his intention is to prostrate himself to heaven, to God, in other words. Lefi shehishtachava'a bipshut yadayim v'raglayim, and the reason is that prostrating yourself with your hands and your feet, this is what we're talking about. When we're talking about hishtachava'a, we're talking about a full prostration. Ve'asra Torah la'asot kain, and the Torah has forbidden us to do this chutz min hamikdash, except in the Beit Hamikdash, except in the temple. And et shabtotai tishmoru, you shall guard my Sabbaths, umikdashi tira'u, and you shall fear my sanctuary. Ani Hashem, I am the Lord. Ani Hashem, and there it says, Ne'eman l'shalem sachar. You can count on me to give you the reward for having performed these things. And that is the end of Parshat Bahar. We've completed all the Torah and the Rashi on Parshat Bahar, and next week we will start Bechukotai, and I will do for the rest of the week. We will go back to Torah Tmima for this. I'm going to stop the share. Okay. Any questions before I stop the recording? Yeah, Harlan?
I was wondering about when you are in debt.
Yes.
All right, and you have to sell your land to another Israelite that is very wealthy, a wealthy person.
Yes.
You work, it's not your land anymore, but you work on that land. And can that wealthy person pay you for working there?
Well, basically, you're a sharecropper is what you are at that point. But remember, the land is supposed to go back to you in the Jubilee year.
Yeah, but that's a long time.
It can be. I mean, the Jubilee year is a specific year. It's, so it's every 50th year. So they don't, it's actually been a question as to how to calculate that. And I think there is some attempt to calculate when the Jubilee years occur. But yeah, I mean, essentially, I think you'd be a sharecropper at that point.
Is in one of the Parshas, they said that if you work 7 years, on the 7th year, if you want to leave, you can. If you don't want to leave, then there's something about your ear on the post. I don't understand that either.
Yeah, right. So basically, we're talking about an Israelite slave or an Israelite who was sold to pay off a theft, where a has sold this person to someone else, and in the 7th year, this person has to go free. His master has to release him in the 7th year. What the Torah discusses in Parshat Mishpatim is if the servant likes his master and is happy in that situation.
Mm-hmm.
In that case, the master takes him and and puts a pin through the lobe of his ear to a doorpost. Okay, it's just temporarily. It's
Oh,
symbolic. It's symbolic. Okay, and the way they explain it is the ear that heard, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt," etc. That ear did not take into account that we are only servants to God. In other words, what's being said right here and now, and should have paid more attention. In other words, the idea of selling yourself into servitude in a way is undermining what God has done originally in freeing us from the land of Egypt.
I see. Well,
That's
actually, go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, so that's sort of it's a mark of shame in a way that,
Hmm.
that you should want to be someone's slave.
Well, if I'm a relative, say I'm a wealthy relative,
Yes.
could I ransom him out? Could I pay for his?
That's a it's a really good question. That is not what we're talking about here. Here we're talking about someone who sold themselves to pay a debt, to be able to afford. The situation with that other person has to do with someone who was sold by a court, okay? And what's
Mhm.
happening is he's paying for possible theft or some crime that he has committed that involved monetary loss, okay? And he's having
Mhm.
to pay back this person for having the court sells him, takes the money, and uses that money to give to the person he's wronged. Okay.
Uh,
So in actual fact, the Talmud discusses this, and the actual possibilities of this actually happening are pretty slim. Okay. The way it's discussed in the Talmud. Because if he stole, let's say he stole $1,000, then
okay.
court has to sell him for $1,000 plus whatever compensation this other person, the wrong person is owed, and sometimes that isn't possible. So, yeah,
I think that
different kind of
what I can.
situation. Yeah, I'm gonna guess he has to work it out until
Okay.
until that sixth year, seventh year. Okay,
Hmm.
yeah,
The actually we don't own anything. God owns everything.
of course, right, right. However, that doesn't mean we don't have responsibilities and rules. In other words, if God is the landlord, God has a right to tell us what the rules are in which to utilize his property.
Oh, very
And
good.
it's sort of the understanding there. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay.
Thank you.